He didn't look like someone you should be afraid of. That was always the mistake people made. Nolan Pierce sat in a corner booth of a Chicago cafe on a Tuesday morning, cutting a pancake into small pieces for his 6-year-old daughter, wearing a jacket with a fraying cuff and shoes that had seen better winters. He looked like nobody. He looked like the kind of man you could push around without consequence. Quiet, careful, deliberate, in a way that reads as weakness to people who've never had to be still under fire. And that Tuesday morning, one very loud, very stupid man was about to discover exactly how wrong that assumption could be. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. We release new cinematic stories every week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Stay until the very end. This one will stay with you. The rain had been falling since before dawn. By 7:15 in the morning, it had settled into that particular kind of Chicago drizzle that wasn't heavy enough to justify an umbrella, but cold enough to get into your collar and sit there. The streets outside Harlow's Café on West Madison were slick and gray, and the people who pushed through the front door arrived with wet shoulders and that pinched expression Midwesterners get in November. Not quite miserable, but not pretending to be fine either. Nolan Pierce had gotten there early enough to claim the corner booth near the window. He always did that. Old habit. He liked his back to a wall and a clear sightline to the entrance. His daughter Emma called it the daddy spot because he chose it everywhere they went. Diners, doctors' offices, the public library on Saturdays. She didn't know why. She just knew it was theirs. Emma was 6 years old, small for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a gap between her front teeth that she was convinced made her look like a vampire. She was currently very focused on drawing on the paper placemat with the 4 crayons their server had brought, and she was giving this drawing the kind of intense, unblinking concentration that small children reserve for artwork and cartoons, and deciding whether or not a bug is scary. "That's a good dog," Nolan said, looking at the placemat. "It's a horse." "Right, the legs. I see it now. Horses have longer legs." "That one might be sitting down." Emma looked at him with the flat patience of someone who had heard this kind of thing before. "Horses don't sit down, Dad. Some do." "Name one." He couldn't, so he didn't try. He just reached over and moved her orange juice further from the edge of the table and went back to his coffee. The cafe was warm in that specific way that places get when they're full of wet people who are grateful to be indoors. The windows had fogged lightly along the bottom. The smell was coffee and butter and something faintly cinnamon from whatever the kitchen was putting in the oven that morning. Nolan had ordered the breakfast special, eggs scrambled, toast wheat, no potatoes, because it was $7.95, which was fine. He told himself he wasn't going to count things this month, but he always did. 2 years out of the Navy, and he still noticed price columns before anything else on a menu. He wasn't unhappy about it. That was the thing people never quite understood when they found out he'd left a career like his. The assumption was always that civilian life was a demotion, some kind of failure to reintegrate. But Nolan didn't experience it that way. He experienced it as mornings exactly like this one, where nobody was going to shoot at him, and Emma was drawing a horse that looked like a dog, and the coffee was decent, and he had nowhere to be until 9 o'clock when he dropped her at school. He'd take that. Every single day, he would take that. What he was thinking about, in that specific drifting way that early mornings allow, was whether the check engine light on his Ford had anything to do with the sound it had been making last Thursday, and whether he could push it another 2 weeks before the Kellerman job paid out. He was doing private security consulting now. Nothing dramatic, mostly threat assessments for small businesses and the occasional residential installation. It was fine work, quiet. It kept the lights on and let him pick Emma up from school. He was thinking about the Ford when the front door of Harlow's Café swung open hard enough that the little bell above it swung twice. 3 men came in. They were the kind of men who enter a room like they've already decided they own it. The one in front was maybe 40, thick through the shoulders, wearing a charcoal suit that was expensive enough to make a point, and a tie that was slightly too tight, which gave his neck a faintly pressurized look. He was talking on his phone, not quietly, the way people do when they're aware of their surroundings, but at full projection, the way people do when they want everyone nearby to understand that whoever they're talking to matters. "No, listen to me," he was saying as he pushed through the door. "I don't care what Chen's team submitted. That number is wrong, and if Marcus can't see that, then Marcus is the problem. Get him on a call this afternoon." His two companions laughed at something behind him. They were younger, late 20s, both in suits, both with the slightly performative ease of men who've decided that laughing at everything their boss says is a professional strategy. Nolan clocked them the way he clocked everything, not obsessively, just out of habit, the way you check your mirrors when you drive, and then looked back at his coffee. Emma held up the placemat. "I added a tail." "Excellent development," Nolan said. The man on the phone was named Brandon Cole. Nolan would learn this later. At the moment, he only knew him as the loud one by the door, who was now gesturing at the hostess station with the impatience of someone who considers waiting in line a personal insult. "We need a table," Brandon said into the gap between his phone conversation. Something by the window. The hostess, a young woman in her early 20s with her hair pulled back and the quiet competence of someone who's been doing this for a while, glanced up. "I've got about a 10-minute wait for—" "That's not going to work." He wasn't rude about it exactly, but he had that particular tone, the tone of a man who has been told yes so many times in professional contexts that he's forgotten no is a word. "We're on a schedule. Is there something open?" There wasn't. The cafe was full. It was a Tuesday morning in November, and people wanted to be warm. Nolan watched this briefly and then watched the hostess handle it well, firm, polite, not flustered, and the three men ended up at a waiting area near the counter. Brandon's phone call resumed. One of the younger men scrolled his phone. The other one looked around the cafe with the mild contempt of someone who considers this kind of place beneath him, which made Nolan wonder, not for the first time, what it must feel like to go through life being disappointed by perfectly good things. Emma had started a new drawing. This one appeared to be a sun with arms. "Is the sun waving?" Nolan asked. "It's reaching down to get something." "What's it reaching for?" She considered this with great seriousness. "A sandwich, probably." "Suns eat sandwiches. Good to know." She didn't look up. "Everything eats sandwiches, Dad." He smiled at that and drank his coffee. Their server came back, a tired-looking man named Ray, who had the good instincts to keep Emma's orange juice topped up without being asked. And Nolan's breakfast arrived. He ate slowly. He taught himself that. In the Navy, you ate fast because time was always the enemy. Now he ate slow because he could, because Emma was still drawing, because there was no reason to rush. He didn't see Brandon coming. That was the honest thing to admit afterward, though it didn't change anything. He'd been looking at Emma, watching her explain to the son why sandwiches were important, and he wasn't watching the room the way he normally did, because why would he? He was in a cafe in the morning with his daughter. He'd let his guard down by approximately the width of one Tuesday morning in November, which was not very much, but apparently enough. Brandon was moving through the cafe toward the back, toward the restrooms maybe, or toward someone he'd spotted, and he was still on his phone, and he was not watching where he was going, because in Brandon Cole's experience, the world generally arranged itself around him rather than requiring him to navigate it. He hit Nolan's table hard, not his shoulder, his hip, with enough force that the table skidded 6 inches and Nolan's coffee mug tipped, and what was left in it sloshed outward in a dark wave across the table and directly toward Emma. Nolan's hand moved before he'd processed it. His palm came flat down on the table's edge, and he caught Emma's orange juice before it followed the coffee. Emma had pulled back fast. Good reflexes. She'd had that since she was small, always a quick kid. And the hot coffee hit the far edge of the placemat and the table itself, but not her arm, not her clothes, not her face. Not her. Nolan exhaled. "Hey," he said, not loudly. "Watch it." Brandon had steadied himself and was still on his phone. He looked down at the mess, then up at Nolan, and something shifted in his expression. Not apology, nothing close to it. More like irritation at having been inconvenienced. "It was an accident," he said, and turned back to his phone. "You almost got my daughter," Nolan said. That was it. That was the whole of what he said. He wasn't angry yet. Not really. Not the kind of anger that does something. He was mostly running the inventory. Emma was okay, the coffee hadn't reached her, the orange juice was saved, the placemat was ruined, but that was nothing. He was already doing the math on whether any of this required anything further from him. Brandon put his hand over his phone. I said it was an accident. People bump into things. He looked at Emma, not with warmth, just the evaluating look of someone cataloging what he was dealing with, and then back at Nolan. Buy the kid another juice. I've got the juice, Nolan said. I'm telling you to watch where you're going. Something changed in Brandon's face then. It was subtle, the way it usually is with men like him. A slight hardening, a recalibration. He'd heard something in Nolan's voice that he didn't like, or maybe it was something he saw. A man who hadn't apologized for existing, who hadn't immediately adjusted himself to accommodate the inconvenience Brandon represented. And for a man like Brandon Cole, that was a problem. He ended his phone call. He looked at Nolan properly for the first time. The worn jacket, the work-scarred hands, the coffee from a $7 breakfast plate still spreading across a table that probably cost more to sit at than Nolan had budgeted for the morning. And Nolan saw exactly what was happening, because he'd seen it before, in smaller contexts and larger ones. He saw a man deciding that he could afford to do this. You know what your problem is? Brandon said. He dropped his voice to something with an edge to it. You're in a place you can't afford, making a scene about a little spilled coffee, and you want to make it my problem. He gestured at the table, dismissive, almost theatrical. That's embarrassing. Nobody's making a scene, Nolan said. He looked at Emma. She was very still, the way children go still when they sense that something is wrong and aren't sure what to do yet. Hey, he said quietly to her. Want to get your coat? You don't get to just walk away from me, Brandon said. Nolan looked back up. I wasn't asking. He started to slide out of the booth, and Emma came with him, tucking herself close to his side the way she did when things were uncertain. Nolan kept his hand on her shoulder, light, steady, and reached into his jacket pocket for his wallet to leave cash on the table. That was when Brandon said it. He said it at a volume that the four nearest tables heard clearly, and he said it with the particular confidence of a man who is sure the room agrees with him. Typical, Brandon said. Can't even afford to clean up after yourself. What kind of father brings a kid to a place and can't? Hey! One of Brandon's companions had moved closer. The bigger one, wide across the chest, the kind of wide that comes from a gym and the confidence it provides. He was grinning, and the grin was worse than the anger would have been. I think he's embarrassed to be. Let's just... No. Brandon was looking at Nolan with something that had stopped being irritation and become something else, something that wanted an audience. I want to know what this guy's plan is. You going to pay for the mess? Or am I going to have to flag down the manager and explain that a customer without enough money to be here made a disturbance? The cafe had gone quiet in that radius. Not the whole place. People further back were still talking, still ordering. But the tables nearest them had gone to the particular stillness of people who aren't sure whether to look or look away. Emma's hand found Nolan's jacket and held it. He felt that. He felt exactly that. We're leaving, Nolan said. He wasn't talking to Brandon. He was talking to Emma. He put his hand gently on her back and moved toward the door. Brandon stepped in front of him. Not aggressive, not with his hands, just with his body, in the way that men sometimes do when they want to demonstrate that they control the geometry of a situation. The second companion had drifted to the left, not quite blocking, but positioned. The big one was still grinning. You're being rude, Brandon said, almost pleasantly. I'm talking to you. Nolan looked at him, at the tie that was slightly too tight, at the phone still in his hand, at the absolute certainty in his eyes that this was going to play out the way these things always played out for him. Move, Nolan said. Or what? Brandon tilted his head. He looked back at his companions with a brief, satisfied expression, then back to Nolan. What exactly do you think happens next? You going to do something in front of your daughter? He looked down at Emma, not meanly, which was somehow worse just with the assessment of a man who has identified a useful piece of leverage. You know what I can do? I can make one call to the right person, and you're explaining to Child Services why you thought this was an appropriate environment for... She's fine, Nolan said quietly. She looks scared, Brandon said. You think that looks good? And that was the thing, right there. That was the moment. It wasn't the insults, though those had been building. It wasn't the spilled coffee or the public embarrassment or any of the rest of it. It was the word scared applied to his daughter, in a voice that implied that Nolan was the cause, in front of a room full of strangers. Emma looked up at him. She wasn't crying yet. She was doing that thing where she was deciding whether to cry, where her face held the question. "Hey," Nolan said softly, crouching slightly so he was at her level. "Remember what we do?" She nodded, small and fast. "Close your eyes," he said. "Count to 10. She did. She put her face against his arm and started counting, and her voice was barely a whisper. Nolan stood back up. Brandon watched this with the expression of a man who thinks he's watching someone stall. He put one hand on Nolan's chest. Not a punch, not even a shove yet, just a placement, just the establishing of a boundary. And said, "Don't walk away from me when I'm—" He never finished the sentence. What happened next was not dramatic in the way people expect violence to be dramatic. There was no shouting. There were no wild swings. It was brief and efficient, and it happened with a precision that seemed, to the people watching, almost impossible. Because Nolan Pierce still had Emma against his left side, his left hand still steady on her shoulder, and he managed what he managed using only his right and his body and the geometry of the space between them. And when it was done, Brandon Cole was on the floor, and the big companion was holding his wrist with an expression of profound confusion, and the other one had backed away so fast he'd hit the neighboring table and knocked someone's coffee cup. It had taken approximately 4 seconds. Emma reached 10 and opened her eyes. The cafe was absolutely silent. Nolan looked around the room, not defiant, not proud, just taking stock the way he'd been trained to take stock, and he realized that approximately 40 people were staring at him. He looked down at Emma. "You okay?" he asked. She looked at the men on the floor. She looked back at him. "You didn't put me down," she said. "No." She considered this. "You do everything with one hand." "Most things," he said. And somewhere across the cafe, a woman in a dark blazer lowered her coffee cup slowly, watching him with an expression that was not surprise. She'd seen what was coming several seconds before it happened, but rather the careful attention of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected, and is now doing a very fast recalculation about the morning she thought she was having. The silence lasted about 3 seconds. Then Brandon Cole made a sound, somewhere between a grunt and a word that didn't quite form, and the cafe exhaled back into noise. Not the comfortable noise from before, the clatter of silverware and murmured conversation. This was something tighter, more electric, the noise of 40 people trying to process what they'd just witnessed and figure out how to respond to it. Brandon was on one knee, one hand pressed flat to the floor, blinking. He looked less injured than stunned, the kind of stunned that comes not from pain but from the fundamental violation of an expectation. He'd expected something else to happen. He'd been so certain of it that the reality of the floor against his palm hadn't fully registered yet. The big companion, Nolan would later learn his name was Derek, was cradling his right wrist and breathing through his nose in the deliberate way of a man who is deciding whether he's angry or scared and hasn't landed on one yet. His wrist wasn't broken. Nolan had been precise about that. But it would ache for a week, and Derek would know, every time it did, that he'd been outclassed by a man who hadn't put down his daughter to do it. The third one, the younger one, had put 2 tables between himself and Nolan and was doing a poor job of pretending this was accidental. Ray, the server, was standing at the counter holding a coffee pot he'd forgotten to put down, staring. Emma's fingers were still gripped in the fabric of Nolan's jacket. She'd opened her eyes at 10, seen what had happened, and had been very quiet since. She was doing what she sometimes did when she was processing something, going very still and very watchful, storing it up to ask about later when they were somewhere private. Nolan kept his hand on her shoulder and looked at the room with the calm of a man doing a damage assessment. The damage was this. He was a 32-year-old man in a fraying jacket who had just put 2 people on the floor of a crowded Chicago cafe on a Tuesday morning, and approximately 40 witnesses had seen it, and the sound of sirens, distant but sharpening, was starting to thread itself through the ambient noise from outside. He'd known the sirens were coming. Someone had called the moment it started, maybe before. Chicago restaurants had security cameras and nervous regulars and people who called 911. the way other people cleared their throat, reflexively, as a first response to any ambiguity. Brandon had gotten back to his feet. He was straightening his jacket, the gesture of a man recollecting himself, trying to get back inside the character he'd been playing. And when he turned to face the room, what Nolan saw in his face was not embarrassment. It was not remorse. It was the recalculation. "Somebody call the police?" Brandon said, loud enough for the room. He touched his jaw where he hadn't actually been hit. Theater, pure theater, and pointed at Nolan. "This man attacked me, unprovoked." His voice had found its footing again. That executive register, the one that expected rooms to organize themselves around it. "There are 40 witnesses here. He attacked me and my colleagues." A few people looked uncertain. That was the thing about 40 witnesses. Not all of them had been watching from the beginning. Not all of them had seen the hand on the chest, the blocked exit, the child pressed into her father's jacket counting to 10. Some of them had looked up only at the end, at the part that looked like violence, at the man standing and the other man on the floor. And Nolan knew how that looked. He knew exactly how that looked. "Emma," he said quietly, "stay close to me." "I am," she said. "Good." He looked toward the door and did the math. 2 officers, minimum, would be through it in under 2 minutes. He had 2 minutes to figure out whether walking out was an option and whether it would make things worse, and he was running through this quickly and without panic. The math was the math, and panicking about it didn't change it. When a voice cut through the cafe noise from somewhere to his left. "Sit down, Brandon." It wasn't loud. That was the strange thing about it. The cafe was buzzing with anxious noise, and this voice came through it not by being louder than everything else, but by having a quality that made everything else feel like it should step back. Precise. Unhurried. The voice of someone who has never needed volume to be heard. Nolan turned. The woman who had spoken was sitting at a 2-top near the east wall, and she'd been there the whole time. He'd clocked her when they came in, briefly, the way he clocked everyone. Dark blazer over a light blouse, no jewelry except a watch he hadn't been close enough to identify. Dark hair pulled back in a way that looked functional rather than styled. She had a coffee cup and a tablet in front of her, and the particular stillness of someone who'd been watching events develop with professional patience rather than civilian alarm. She was looking at Brandon Cole the way a person looks at something they've already decided about. Brandon looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not fear exactly, more like the first intimation of a category error, a man who isn't sure yet what he's dealing with. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he said. She didn't answer that. She looked at her tablet for a moment, then set it face down on the table, then stood. She was about 5'8", and the way she moved from her chair to standing had the particular economy of someone who doesn't waste motion. She picked up her coffee cup, took a small sip, set it back down. "You blocked the exit," she said. "You put your hand on his chest. 2 of your colleagues moved to his flanks." She said this with the neutrality of someone reading items off a list. "He asked you to move 3 separate times. That's what happened." Brandon's expression had shifted to something more careful. "I don't know who you think you are." "You also mentioned child services," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "That's the part I found particularly interesting. That was deliberate. You looked at the child when you said it." She paused. "You should sit down." "Lady, the cameras in here are owned by the building management, which is Harlow Properties, LLC." She said this with the same flat neutrality. "I know this because my firm completed a due diligence review of their asset portfolio 11 months ago. The camera above the counter covers the section you're standing in. It's been recording since before you walked through the door." She picked up her coffee again. "Sit down." The sirens outside had gotten sharper, less than a minute now. Brandon stared at her. The recalculation in his face had become something more complicated. A man trying to figure out how a Tuesday morning had arrived at a place where he was being told to sit down by a woman he'd never met, in a cafe full of people, while police closed in. "You don't know who I am," he said, but the authority in it had leaked. "Brandon Cole," she said, "Senior Vice President, Acquisitions at Meridian Investment Group. You've been with them for 6 years. Before that, Hartwell Capital." She glanced at the 2 companions. "Derek Marsh, your division's risk analyst. I don't know the third one. I assume he's new." She set the coffee down for the last time. Sit down. You're making it worse. The front door of Harlow's Café opened and two CPD officers came in. They were young, early 30s both of them, one male, one female, and they did what officers do when they enter an unresolved situation. They stopped just inside the door and took a fast visual inventory of the room. Their eyes went immediately to the two men who were obviously not where they were supposed to be. Brandon standing in the middle of the floor, Derek still holding his wrist, and then to Nolan, who was standing with a child at his side and his hands plainly visible, because Nolan Pierce had been trained in how to not get shot by law enforcement, and he was applying that training now. "What's going on, Buzz?" the female officer said. Brandon moved first. He'd had his opening line ready. "Officer, this man assaulted me and two of my colleagues." He pointed at Nolan. "Unprovoked attack. I want to press charges." The officer looked at Nolan, then at Emma, who was looking back at her with the solemn assessment of a 6-year-old who takes uniform seriously. "Sir," she said to Nolan, "can you stay where you are?" "Yes, ma'am," Nolan said. The male officer was moving around the perimeter of the space, reading the room. The upended situation near Nolan's table, Derek's wrist, the third companion backed against the far wall. "Was anyone injured?" he asked the room generally. "My wrist," Derek said, and immediately heard how it sounded because the female officer's eyes went to him and then to Emma and then back to Nolan with a slightly different quality. "What happened to the table?" she asked. "Brandon Cole collided with it," said the woman from across the cafe, and she was on her feet now, moving through the room toward the officers, and she had her phone out and was holding it in a way that suggested she'd already done something with it. He knocked it into the child. Hot coffee. The child avoided injury. He refused to apologize. He blocked the exit when the father tried to leave with his daughter, put his hand on the father's chest, and made explicit reference to calling child services, at which point the father defended himself and his child. She stopped about 4 feet from the officers and held out her phone. On the screen was a video. It was from above. Building security, the angle she'd mentioned, the camera above the counter. And it had clearly been accessed in the past 90 seconds, while everything was still happening, which meant she had pull with the building management or a login she shouldn't technically have, or both. The female officer took the phone and watched for about 15 seconds. Her face did a thing. She handed it to her partner. He watched it. His face did the same thing. "Sir," the female officer said, and this time she was looking at Brandon. "Can you step over here for me?" Brandon's composure had been eroding since the woman started talking, and it had reached a new low. "I'm the one who was assaulted." "Sir, I'm asking you to step over here." "This is ridiculous." But he moved. He moved because he didn't have a better option. Nolan stayed where he was. Emma was leaning into his side now, not from fear. She'd passed through the fear stage and come out the other side into the state she got in sometimes, this watchful, almost philosophical calm. And he kept his arm around her and watched the room and tried to get a read on where this was going. The woman caught his eye across the cafe. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him for a moment with the same careful, evaluating expression she'd had since she spoke, and then she looked back at the officers. He still didn't know who she was. He was starting to suspect the answer was going to complicate his Tuesday significantly. The male officer handed the phone back to the woman and pulled out his own notepad. "Ma'am, can I get your name?" "Victoria Sterling," she said. Nothing in the cafe changed dramatically when she said it, but Ray the server put the coffee pot down. The hostess near the entrance looked up fast. A woman at the table nearest the window visibly straightened. Nolan didn't react because the name wasn't in any context he could place immediately. He'd been out of Chicago's business world entirely since leaving the Navy, deliberately, because that world wasn't his world, but he filed it. He watched the way the officer's pen hesitated almost imperceptibly before writing it down. He noted the quality of the attention that shifted in the room. "Ms. Sterling," the officer said, and his voice had taken on a slight formality it hadn't had 30 seconds ago. "You've already accessed the building security footage?" "I have authorization from Harlow Properties building manager," she said. "I've already sent the full clip to your department's digital intake. Reference number is in a message I just forwarded to the duty sergeant." She looked at the officer steadily. I've also taken the liberty of sending it to my legal team for documentation. Brandon, across the cafe, had heard all of this. The color in his face had done something complicated. She's interfering, he started. She's a witness providing evidence, the male officer said without looking at him. Sir, I need you to be quiet. The next 15 minutes were the particular kind of slow that emergency situations become once the acute moment passes and the machinery of consequence takes over. Officers asked questions. Statements were given. Derek sat down at an empty table and continued to hold his wrist. The third companion was so thoroughly irrelevant to the proceedings that he eventually just went and paid the table's check and stood near the door. Nolan answered every question he was asked with the specific, minimal precision of someone who knows exactly what detail is useful and what isn't. Rank, service record, circumstances of the physical engagement. He didn't editorialize. He didn't offer anything he wasn't asked for. He was calm in a way that the female officer noticed and noted. "You were Navy?" she said, at a slight tangent from the official line of questioning. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment, then back at her notepad. "What were you doing this morning before the incident?" "Having breakfast with my daughter," he said. "She was drawing a horse." Emma, from beside him, said, "It had a tail." The officer looked at Emma. Her expression shifted briefly to something warmer. "How old are you?" "6," Emma said. "How old are you?" The officer smiled despite herself. "Old enough." She looked back at Nolan. "You got any pending issues? Anything that would complicate—" "No priors," Nolan said. "Clean record. I can get you references from 3 retired JAG officers if needed. Former CO's contact information as well." He said this without pride. Just information, offered in the spirit of making everyone's morning more efficient. The officer wrote something down. Brandon, having given his statement to the male officer, crossed the cafe and tried to re-enter the situation. "I still want to press charges," he said. His voice had found some of its previous register, but it sounded slightly hollow now, like a recording of the original. "This man is dangerous. There's a child involved. Mr. Cole," the female officer said, "you put your hand on the other party. The footage is clear." He stopped, started again. "That was a misunderstanding. You also blocked the exit." "I was talking to him." After he indicated he wanted to leave, with his daughter, the officer looked at him with the patience of someone who does this every day. "Sir, right now, based on the evidence available, you initiated the physical contact in this exchange. That changes the picture significantly." Brandon's jaw tightened. The financier read the room the way financiers do, quickly and practically, and what he read in it was the first real evidence that this morning had turned against him in a way he hadn't predicted and might not be able to reverse with volume or leverage. He looked at Victoria Sterling. She was leaning against the counter near the window, arms loosely crossed, watching with an expression that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite neutrality. Something in the middle. The expression of someone allowing a situation to arrive at its logical conclusion without intervention. "You're really doing this," he said to her. Not a question exactly. "I'm a witness," she said. "I told them what I saw." "You know who I work for?" She held his gaze. "I do." "Then you know—" "Brandon," she said, and the tone of it was the first thing that had any temperature in it. Not warm, not cold exactly, but specific. "What I know is that you knocked a hot beverage toward a 6-year-old, refused to apologize, blocked the exit when her father tried to leave, made a specific threat involving Child Protective Services, and then physically initiated an altercation." She paused. "That's what I know. That's what the camera shows. And it's what I'll say in any proceeding where I'm asked." The male officer was already on his radio. Brandon stared at her for a long moment. Then something happened in his expression that was harder to read. Not calculation this time, not performance, but something quieter and uglier underneath it. The look of a man who had expected a different kind of morning and was still, on some level, refusing to adjust. "You have no idea what you're starting," he said. "I'm sure you believe that," she said. The officer finished his radio call and stepped toward Brandon. "Mr. Cole, I'm going to need you to come with me." Brandon turned. He looked at the officer with the automatic protest rising. Nolan could see it forming, the reflex of a man who's spent 20 years being the most important person in any given room. And then he looked at the camera above the counter. And then he looked at Emma, who was watching him with the solemn, uncomplicated gaze of a child who has decided she doesn't like him and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He went with the officer. Derek followed without being asked. The third companion, whose name nobody had ever gotten, slipped out while the room was focused elsewhere. Ray the server appeared at Nolan's elbow with a fresh coffee, which he set down on the newly straightened table and said, "On the house," with the tone of a man who'd made a decision he felt good about. "You don't have to," Nolan started. "It's coffee," Ray said. "Don't make it weird." Nolan sat down. Emma climbed back into her side of the booth and looked at the ruined placemat, then up at Ray. "Can I have a new one?" she asked. The horse got wet. Ray produced a fresh placemat from somewhere without comment, along with 2 more crayons, and Emma settled in with the gravity of someone resuming important work. Nolan wrapped both hands around the fresh coffee cup and stared at the table for a moment. His hands weren't shaking, they never did. That wasn't what happened to him afterward. What happened was more like a slow-moving thing, a kind of clarity that settled in once the adrenaline stepped back, a full inventory of every choice made and whether each one had been right, and the particular familiar weight of being someone who can do things most people can't and carrying the awareness of what that means. Emma was fine. She was drawing. That was the fact that everything else orbited. He became aware that someone had sat down across from him at the edge of the booth. He looked up. Victoria Sterling was standing just outside the booth, not sitting, not yet, standing in a way that suggested she was offering him the choice of whether to continue this or not. Up close, she was different from across the cafe, not in any dramatic way, but in the specific way that proximity always changes a person. There were faint shadows under her eyes that concealed makeup hadn't quite covered. Her blazer had a small mark on the left sleeve that looked like it might be ink. She looked like someone who'd been up since 5 and was running on the 3rd coffee of the morning and didn't particularly care who knew it. She looked like an actual person, was the thing. Which was not what Nolan had expected, though he couldn't have said exactly what he had expected. "I was going to leave," she said, "but I wanted to make sure you were—" She stopped, reconsidered. That she was okay. She looked at Emma. Emma looked up from the fresh placemat. "My horse got ruined," she said. "I'm making a new one." "What does the new horse look like?" Victoria asked. "Better," Emma said. "This one has a saddle." Victoria looked at the placemat. "It does." She looked back at Nolan. He was watching her with the direct, unhurried attention that she'd noticed from across the cafe, not unfriendly, but not performing friendliness either. The look of someone who was used to reading people and was doing it now without bothering to hide that he was. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did." "I told them what happened." "You didn't have to. You could have stayed where you were and had your coffee." She considered that. "No," she said after a moment. "I don't think I could have." There was a beat of quiet between them, not uncomfortable, just the particular pause of 2 people who have been through something small but sharp together and are finding their footing in the aftermath. "You were watching before it happened," Nolan said. Not accusatory, just the observation. She sat down then, on the edge of the seat across from him. "I noticed you when you came in, and then I noticed him." "What did you notice?" She thought about how to answer that. "The breathing," she said finally. "When he blocked the exit and the other 2 moved, you didn't breathe faster. Most people do." She held his gaze. "The way you positioned her, your left side away from the threat vectors. The way you told her to close her eyes. It wasn't—" She paused, choosing. "That's not how most fathers respond. That's trained response." Nolan was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't notice that," he said. "Most people haven't spent enough time around people who are trained the way you're trained." She said it without elaboration, and she watched him decide whether to ask about it, and he decided not to, which she noted. Emma held up the placemat. "Does this look better?" They both looked. The new horse had 4 legs of approximately equal length, a recognizable saddle, and what appeared to be a small hat. "Much better," Nolan said. "The hat is good," Victoria said. Emma accepted this and went back to drawing. Nolan's coffee had cooled to the point where it was comfortable to drink. He drank some of it and set the cup down and looked at Victoria Sterling across the table. This woman who had sat across a cafe and read the room with professional precision, who had accessed building security footage faster than the police had thought to ask for it, who had said Brandon Cole's name and his employer and his colleague's name from memory as if she'd been briefed, or as if she simply had that kind of mind. "You know who he works for," Nolan said. "Meridian Investment Group. You knew that without looking it up." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression, a decision being made about how much to answer. "Meridian Investment Group," she said, "is currently in the process of being acquired." She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "By Sterling Capital Group." Nolan looked at her. The name Sterling Capital clicked into place alongside the name she'd given the officers, and even without context for Chicago's financial landscape, he was reasonably good at arithmetic. "That's your company," he said. "It is," she said. "So Brandon Cole's company will finalize transition of ownership in approximately—" She glanced at her watch, a small and instinctive gesture. "6 hours, at which point Brandon Cole will work for me." She picked up his coffee cup without asking and turned it in her hands, not drinking it, just holding it with the automatic motion of someone who needed something to do with their hands. "Or rather," she said, "he will have worked for me. Briefly." Nolan studied her face. "You came here this morning," he said, "to this cafe specifically." "I come here sometimes," she said, "when I want to think without someone standing outside my office door. And you ended up watching all of that." "Yes." "And now Brandon Cole's morning is significantly worse than it would have been." She set his coffee cup back down. "He made the choices he made." "He did," Nolan agreed. He looked at Emma, who had added what might have been mountains to the background of her horse drawing. "So did I." "Yes," she said. "You did." She paused. "You kept your hand on her the entire time." He didn't answer that. "You never put her down," she said. It wasn't an accusation, and it wasn't quite admiration either. It was the observation of someone who had noticed something specific and was sitting with what it meant. "Even to do what you did, you never put her down." Outside, through the fogged cafe window, the police cruiser was still at the curb. The rain had not let up. It was still that specific Chicago drizzle, cold and persistent, the kind that outlasts the people who are annoyed by it. Emma looked up from her drawing and at Nolan and said, "I'm hungry." "We ordered," he said. "That was before," she said. "That was a different breakfast. We should get a new breakfast." Nolan looked at her for a moment. This small person who had been through the morning she'd been through and had arrived at the conclusion that the most urgent issue was a second breakfast, and he felt something move in his chest that he didn't have a clean word for. "Ray!" he called across the cafe. Ray appeared from somewhere. "Yeah? Can we put in another order?" "Already on it," Ray said, and disappeared again. Nolan looked back across the table. Victoria Sterling was watching Emma draw with an expression that had dropped most of its professional surface. Not entirely, not in a way she'd probably have chosen, and what was underneath it was something quieter and harder to name. She caught him watching and looked back up, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You're not from the business world," she said. "I can usually tell." "No," he said. "What do you do?" He considered the question. "Security consulting," he said. "Mostly small scale." She nodded slowly. She was looking at his hands on the table, the specific wear on them, the particular way he'd set them flat rather than folded, the old habitual stillness of them. "I imagine you're good at it," she said. "Pays the bills," he said, which was true in the technical sense and somewhat optimistic in the practical one, and he suspected she heard both of those things in it. Emma held up the placemat one final time. The horse now had mountains, a saddle, a hat, and what appeared to be a small flag on the hat. "This is my best horse," she announced. "It's very good," Victoria said. "You can have it," Emma told her, with the magnanimity of someone making a significant gift. "If you want." Victoria looked at the drawing, then at Emma. then briefly at Nolan, who gave her absolutely nothing in the way of guidance, because some things you have to navigate yourself. "Thank you," Victoria said. She reached out and accepted the drawing carefully, holding it by the edges. "I'll keep it." Emma nodded, satisfied, and began clearing space on the new placemat for whatever came next. The breakfast arrived. The cafe around them had returned to something close to its normal register, the acute strangeness of the morning bleeding back into the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday. Rain on the window, coffee cups, someone near the door laughing at something on their phone. Nolan ate his eggs. He was not yet thinking about what came next. He was thinking about Emma's hand in his jacket, the weight of it, the specific grip of small fingers on worn fabric, and about how the most important skill he'd ever learned in 12 years of military service was not any of the things you'd expect. It was knowing what you were fighting for before the fight started. Everything else, he'd always found, was detail. The second breakfast arrived, and Emma ate with the focused efficiency of someone who considered the morning's earlier drama adequately processed and was ready to move on. She had pancakes this time, which she'd negotiated with Ray through a series of very specific requirements. Syrup on the side, not on top, because syrup on top made the edges soggy, and soggy edges were, in her considered opinion, a waste of pancake. Ray had taken this feedback seriously. Nolan appreciated that about Ray. Victoria had not ordered anything additional, but she hadn't left either. She sat at the edge of the booth with Emma's horse drawing set carefully on the table beside her tablet, and she had what remained of her original coffee, which was probably cold, and she drank it anyway without comment in the manner of someone who has made peace with cold coffee as an occupational constant. Nolan watched Emma eat and thought about the custody thing. That was the part he hadn't said out loud to anyone, not to the officers, not to Victoria, not to himself in any clean or direct way. But it sat in the back of his chest, quiet and persistent, the way certain fears do when you've lived with them long enough that they've stopped announcing themselves dramatically and just become part of the furniture. He had sole custody of Emma, had since she was 3. The paperwork was clean, the arrangement was uncontested. There was no opposing party making arguments because there was nobody left to make them. But there was a particular kind of anxiety that attaches itself to solo parents that doesn't respond to legal clarity, because legal clarity isn't what the anxiety is about. The anxiety is about all the ways a situation can go sideways, regardless of what the paperwork says. Brandon Cole had looked at Emma and said child services, and Nolan had felt something move in his chest that was older and more complicated than anger. He was still sitting with that. "You got quiet," Emma said, without looking up from her pancakes. "Thinking," Nolan said. "About what?" "Nothing interesting." She considered this with the pancake fork halfway to her mouth. "You always say that when it's something." He looked at her. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes, that specific dark brown that had always seemed to contain more information than it should, and he thought, not for the first time, about how unfair it was that she'd inherited that particular quality, because it made it extremely difficult to deflect simple questions. "I'm just thinking about the morning," he said. "The part where the man fell down?" "Yeah." "He was mean first," she said, with great simplicity, the way children sometimes cut to the exact center of a thing without meaning to. "He was," Nolan said. She went back to her pancakes. Case closed, apparently, in her analysis. Nolan picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the rain and thought that maybe 6-year-olds had the right of it. He became aware of Victoria's attention from across the table. Not intrusive, she wasn't leaning in, wasn't doing anything that telegraphed the observation, but it was there. He'd been around enough people with that quality of attention to recognize it, the kind of awareness that didn't broadcast itself. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. And then, after a moment, "You were worried about custody." He looked at her. "He said child services," she said. "You went somewhere for a second after he said that, before everything else." Nolan turned his coffee cup on the table slowly. "That's a specific thing to notice." "It was a specific threat," she said, made in front of a child, deliberately, to produce exactly the response it produced. She looked at Emma briefly, then back at him. "It worked for about 2 seconds. Then you shifted." "He wasn't going to get anywhere with it," Nolan said. "My record's clean." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I looked you up," she said, without any particular apology in it, just the fact. While the officers were taking statements, it didn't take long. Your discharge record is partially accessible through public military archives, and your current business registration in Illinois has a summary of service. Nolan Pierce, formerly Navy SEAL Team 3, 12 years active, honorably discharged, currently registered as a sole proprietor for Pierce Security Consulting. She paused. The rest isn't public. No, he said. It's not. I didn't try to access the rest. What would you have found if you had? She looked at him steadily. I don't know, which is exactly what made me not try. She picked up her coffee. There's classified and then there's classified. I know the difference. Nolan studied her for a long moment. What is it that you actually do? He said. Specifically. Sterling Capital Group, she said, manages a portfolio of acquired companies across financial services, logistics, and mid-market manufacturing. We buy things that are underperforming, restructure them, and either grow them or sell them depending on what makes sense. Currently, we have interests in 14 companies across 6 states. She said this with the same flat directness she used for everything, as if reciting it from a document she'd long since memorized and no longer needed. Meridian Investment Group will be 50. Was 15, Nolan said, past tense, as of 6 hours from now. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile. It didn't quite get there. Was 15. Yes. Across the cafe, the female officer, her name tag read Calloway, was finishing something near the door, and Nolan caught her eye. She moved toward the booth. Mr. Pierce. She stopped at the edge of the table and did a brief inventory of Emma's pancake situation, which seemed to reassure her about something. We've got a pretty clear picture of events. Based on the footage and the witness statements, we're not pursuing charges against you. Mr. Cole and Mr. Marsh will be processed for misdemeanor assault and disorderly conduct. Nolan nodded. Thank you, officer. You'll want to make yourself available if this goes further than citation stage, Calloway said. I'd recommend documenting your own statement in writing today while it's fresh. She glanced at Victoria. Ms. Sterling, appreciate your assistance this morning. Of course, Victoria said. Calloway looked like she was going to say something else, and then she looked at Emma, who had stopped eating and was watching her with that solemn, evaluating gaze. You okay, sweetie? Calloway asked. Emma considered the question with appropriate seriousness. My first horse got ruined, she said, but the second one was better anyway. Calloway blinked. Okay, she said. Good. She looked at Nolan. Take care. She left. The cafe door closed behind her, and the quiet that followed had a different texture than the quiet earlier. Softer, the particular release of a situation that has found its resolution and is settling. The police cruiser pulled away from the curb. The rain continued. Someone in the back of the cafe was laughing again, the easy, rolling laugh of a person who had no idea what had just happened 12 feet from them and was having a perfectly regular Tuesday. Nolan exhaled. It was the first full exhale he'd taken since the coffee had hit the table. Emma noticed. She always noticed. All done? She said. Almost, he said. Eat your pancakes. She ate her pancakes. Victoria had been quiet through the exchange with Calloway in a way that felt deliberate, present but pulled back, giving him space that he hadn't asked for and hadn't known he needed. He found himself reevaluating her in real time, which was a thing he rarely did with people. He was generally good on first reads. He'd had to be. But Victoria Sterling was doing something subtle with the distance between what she showed and what was underneath it, and he was still working out the geometry of it. You didn't have to stay, he said. The morning got complicated, she said. I wanted to make sure it uncomplicated properly. It did. It did. She looked at Emma. She's very calm for a child who just went through what she went through. She's been through worse, Nolan said, and heard himself say it, and the space afterward was the specific quiet that follows a sentence that discloses more than it intends to. Victoria didn't pursue it. She just nodded. That was also something he noted about her. Emma had finished her pancakes and was now working on the new placemat with a kind of free associating energy. There was a horse, and also what appeared to be a bus, and possibly a bridge. She was narrating quietly to herself, which she did when she was content, a low-level running commentary that Nolan had learned to find deeply reassuring because the silence that replaced it was what you paid attention to. He looked at Victoria across the table. He didn't want to ask the question that was forming, because asking it would change the tenor of the conversation in a way he wasn't sure he wanted. But he was also someone who had learned that not asking questions was itself a kind of decision, and not always the right one. "The Meridian acquisition," he said. "How long has that been in process?" She looked at him. "About 8 months." "And Brandon Cole knew about it?" "Not the details," she said. "The existence? Yes. Anyone senior at Meridian would have known Sterling Capital was in the conversation. It's a significant deal. Things like that create a kind of atmospheric awareness inside a firm. People know something's happening without necessarily knowing what. So he knew this morning that there was a possibility the woman across the cafe could end up owning his job. "Probably," she said, "or a version of that." "And he still—" Nolan stopped. "Yes," she said. "He's still." They let that sit. "What kind of man does that?" he said. Not rhetorically exactly, more like a thing he was genuinely trying to understand. "The kind who's been doing it for long enough that he's stopped expecting consequences," she said. She turned her coffee cup in her hands again. That same automatic gesture, the small fidget of someone who doesn't have many. "He's not unusual. That's the depressing part. Men like Brandon they're not rare in the world I operate in. They're actually quite common. They learn early that a certain kind of presence, a certain kind of volume, smooths things over, gets them what they want. And after 15 years of that, the feedback loop is so established that their judgment just erodes. They stop being able to read a room because they've never had to." "Until today," Nolan said. "Until today." She looked at him directly. "And today was always going to happen. I just didn't expect to be here for it." Emma held up the placemat. The image had expanded to include not just the horse and the bus, but what appeared to be an entire city. "This is Chicago," she announced. "It's a very good Chicago," Nolan said. "Do you know what city this is?" Emma asked Victoria. "Chicago," Victoria said immediately. Emma looked pleased. "Right, the horse lives here." "Good place for a horse," Victoria said. Emma accepted this and returned to her city. The morning was technically still happening. It was only 9:15, which seemed absurd given the volume of events that had already occurred, and Nolan became aware of time again in the practical sense. He had to get Emma to school. She was already going to be late, which she had opinions about because she had a thing on Tuesdays, something with reading groups that she treated with the gravity of a professional obligation. And he needed to call the school and explain. And then he needed to go back to his apartment and write the incident statement Calloway had recommended. And he needed to find out whether any of this was going to show up in a way that required a lawyer. And he did not particularly want to think about affording a lawyer right now. He was running through this list in the back of his head with the part of his mind that was always running lists when Victoria said, "Can I show you something?" He looked at her. She had turned her tablet around. On the screen was a news alert, something that had pushed through in the last few minutes, from a Chicago financial news aggregator. The headline was about Sterling Capital Group completing the acquisition of Meridian Investment Group, which was not news. She'd told him that. But the secondary text, the subparagraph below the headline, mentioned the immediate restructuring of Meridian's senior leadership team. Nolan read it. "That went public fast," he said. "I made a call while Calloway was taking my statement," she said. "Our communications team was already prepared. The timing just—" She paused. "Moved up. Because of what happened this morning. The acquisition was going to close today regardless," she said. "The leadership restructuring was also already planned. I simply communicated the timeline internally." Nolan looked at her. "You fired him before the morning was over." "The paperwork will reflect a termination effective today," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He didn't know exactly what he felt about that. Something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite discomfort. Something in the middle. The place where justice and power overlap, and you're not entirely sure whether to be grateful or careful. You were going to remove him anyway, he said. Eventually, she said. Brandon's record at Meridian has issues that predate this morning by several years. Today just clarified the timeline. That's a careful way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it, she said, and then, more quietly, he put his hand on a child's father and called a 6-year-old a liability. Accuracy and timing aren't mutually exclusive. Nolan looked at Emma, who was adding what appeared to be a small sun to the upper right corner of her Chicago drawing, complete with arms. Does it reach for sandwiches? He asked. Emma looked at the sun. Probably, she said. Suns are always hungry. He had not expected to laugh. It wasn't a big laugh, just a small, exhaled thing, but it came up genuinely and without effort, which was somewhat unusual for him on days that had started the way this one had. Victoria was watching him when he looked back. The professional surface was still there, but the top layer of it had worn thin in a way that the last hour had produced, and what was underneath was something more complicated and more interesting. You should give me your number, she said, in case anything comes up legally. I have a team that handles these situations and they can... I appreciate it, he said, but I'll be fine. I know you'll be fine, she said. I meant in case Cole's attorneys try to preemptively frame the narrative before the charges are formalized, which they will. It's what people like him do when the situation turns on them. They hire people whose job is to build an alternate story and push it out fast. She looked at him steadily. My team's faster, and they're better at it. He held her gaze. Why? He said. She didn't deflect the question. Because he threatened your daughter to get at you, she said. And that's not something I'm willing to step back from. He studied her face for a long moment, looking for the angle, the way he'd been trained to look for it. The secondary motivation, the play inside the play. It was always there with people who operated at the level she operated at, always some larger board they were moving pieces on. He didn't find it, which didn't mean it wasn't there. It meant either she was very good at concealing it or she was telling him something straightforward, and in his experience, those two possibilities were harder to distinguish than people assumed. He pulled out his phone. It was an older model with a cracked corner on the screen that he kept meaning to fix. He typed in his number and turned the screen toward her. She entered it into her own phone. Something thinner and more current, though not aggressively so. And then she looked up and said, I'm going to have my legal team send you something this afternoon. You don't have to use it, but you should have it. Okay, he said. Emma looked up from her drawing. We have to go, she said. I have reading group. I know, Nolan said. Mrs. Patterson waits, but she makes a face. We'll apologize to Mrs. Patterson. I didn't do anything, Emma said. We'll explain that. She appeared to find this acceptable and began putting on her coat, which she did by putting both arms in at once and then shrugging it up, which was her method, and defied instruction. Nolan helped her with the zipper without being asked because she occasionally struggled with it and had strong feelings about struggling with it publicly. He left cash on the table for Ray, more than he should have, technically, given the state of the Ford check engine situation, but some things mattered more than the math, and pulled on his own jacket. Victoria had stood. They were both standing, and Emma was between them, with her coat zipped and her placemat drawing of Chicago rolled up under one arm, which she'd decided was coming with her, and there was a moment where the three of them were simply there in that specific way, the cafe around them warm and ordinary, the rain outside, the situation that had started this morning somewhere behind them now. Thank you, Nolan said again. He meant it differently than the first time. She nodded. Tell Mrs. Patterson it wasn't your fault, she said to Emma. Emma looked at her. She won't believe me. Tell her anyway, Victoria said. That's important. Even when people don't believe you, you say the true thing. Emma considered this. She looked at Victoria with the specific, careful attention she gave to things that deserved it. Okay, she said, and then, you can keep the horse. I know, Victoria said. I'm going to. Nolan moved toward the door. He was almost there. Emma's hand in his, the cold of the day already reaching through the glass, when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Unknown number, text message. This isn't over. You have no idea who you just made an enemy of. He stared at the message for a moment, then he put the phone back in his pocket. He already knew who had sent it, and he already knew, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 12 years reading threats for a living, exactly what it was: a reflex, the last move of someone who had just lost control of a situation and was trying to claw back the feeling of power through the only avenue still available to him. It was the textual equivalent of throwing something against a wall on the way out. It was also, he noted, sent from a private number, which meant Brandon Cole had done it himself, personally, without running it past anyone with legal training. Amateur hour. He pushed open the cafe door and the cold November air came in at them, wet and specific, and Emma immediately pressed herself against his side because she hated the cold with a personal intensity. "Walk fast," she said. "We'll walk fast," he agreed. Behind him, through the glass, he was aware of Victoria Sterling still at the table, her phone in one hand and the horse drawing in the other. He didn't look back. He had a feeling, not certainty, just the kind of low-frequency read that his instincts sometimes produced, that the morning was not actually finished, that something had started in that cafe beyond the thing that was apparently finished, and that the text on his phone and the card she'd entered into her contacts and the horse drawing on good paper were all somehow threaded together in a way that hadn't resolved yet. But that was later. Right now, Emma was cold, and Mrs. Patterson made a face, and there was a Ford with a check engine light that was becoming a more urgent problem by the day, and the rain was the rain, and the sidewalk was wet, and his daughter's hand was in his. He walked. 3 blocks north on West Madison, with Emma narrating something about what the Chicago horse in her drawing would eat for breakfast. Oats, she had decided, but also possibly waffles, because horses probably liked waffles if they tried them. Nolan Pierce's phone buzzed again. Different number this time. A number he'd seen entered into a contact screen 20 minutes ago, in a cafe on a Tuesday morning that had turned out to be nothing like a Tuesday morning. The text said, "My team is already working on it. Don't respond to any messages from unknown numbers." He stopped walking. Emma bumped into his side. "Why did we stop?" He read the message again. "Nothing," he said. "You always say that," she said. He put the phone away. "Walk fast," he said, and she said, I know, and they did. The legal documents arrived at 3:17 that afternoon, while Nolan was sitting at his kitchen table writing his incident statement on a yellow legal pad because his printer had been broken since September and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. The documents came through email, a message from a firm called Hargrove and Associates, with a Chicago address and a footer that suggested they had offices in 4 other cities, which was the kind of law firm that Nolan had never had occasion to interact with professionally, because it was the kind of law firm that existed several tax brackets above his operational reality. The email was clean and specific. The firm had been retained by Sterling Capital Group to provide legal support in matters arising from the morning's incident. Attached was a letter of representation for his review, and if he had questions, he should call a direct number that was listed twice, at the top and the bottom, in case he missed it the first time. He read through the letter. It was 3 pages, and it said, in the language that legal documents use, that Brandon Cole's attorney had already filed a counter-narrative with CPD, characterizing the incident as unprovoked assault, and that Hargrove and Associates was already in the process of formally responding with the security footage, 3 signed witness statements, and a timeline of events that began with the table collision and ended with the threatening text message, which meant, Nolan realized, that Victoria's team had somehow already documented the text he'd received on the sidewalk, which meant she'd anticipated it would happen, which meant she'd seen it coming before he had. He sat with that for a moment. He wrote 3 more lines of his statement and then stopped and looked at the kitchen wall, which needed painting. He'd been meaning to paint it since August. There were a lot of things he'd been meaning to do since a general time period that kept shifting forward. His phone rang. Not Victoria this time. A number he recognized. Marcus Webb, retired Master Chief, the man who'd served as Nolan's senior enlisted advisor for the last 4 years of his naval career, and who now lived in Milwaukee and called approximately once a month to check in and complain about the Brewers. He answered. "Webb, I hear you had an interesting morning," Webb said. Nolan paused. "How?" "Calloway's partner is Danny Reyes. Danny Reyes went through Bud/S the same year as my nephew, Small world. There was the sound of Webb settling into a chair. Navy SEAL flattens 3 guys in a cafe while holding his kid. Danny thought that was worth mentioning. I didn't flatten anyone, Nolan said. It was controlled. Danny said it looked like you turned off a light switch. Danny should focus on his police work. He is. He's also recommending you for some kind of good citizen thing. I don't know. Webb's voice shifted to something drier, more direct. You okay? Fine. Emma okay? She's fine. She's at school. She was annoyed about being late for reading group. Good, Webb said. That's good. A pause. So what is it you're not telling me? Nolan looked at the legal documents on his kitchen table, at the yellow legal pad, at the coffee cup he'd made at noon and hadn't finished. It got complicated after, he said. How complicated? The woman who intervened, the witness, her name is Victoria Sterling. A brief pause on Webb's end that communicated a lot. Marcus Webb was not a man who paused at nothing. Sterling Capital Group, Victoria Sterling. You know her. I know of her, Webb said. She bought a logistics company about 2 years ago that had a contract with a base supplier we worked with in Coronado. She cleaned it up fast. Reputation is she's sharp and she doesn't tolerate a lot of nonsense. Another pause. What's the complication? Her legal team is representing me. Silence. Nolan. I know. That's not a small thing. I know that too. What does she want? It was the same question Nolan had been asking himself since 3 blocks north of Harlow's Café, and he still didn't have a clean answer. I don't know yet, he said, which was honest. Maybe nothing. People like that don't do things for nothing, Webb said, not unkindly. It's not an insult, it's just how that world works. There's always a ledger. Maybe, Nolan said. Or maybe a kid almost got hot coffee on her and she doesn't like men who threaten children. Could be both, Webb said. Usually is. After he hung up, he finished the statement and ate a sandwich standing at the counter because he'd forgotten to sit down, and then he picked Emma up at 3:45 from the school on Maple Street, where Mrs. Patterson confirmed, with the mild reproach of a woman who'd been teaching 2nd grade for 19 years, that Emma had arrived late but had contributed meaningfully to the reading group discussion regardless, and that Emma had explained the morning's events in considerable detail to her classmates during free period, characterizing her father as, quote, very good at his job. Nolan chose not to engage with this. In the car on the way home, Emma said, Mrs. Patterson asked if you were a superhero. What did you tell her? I told her you were a dad. He drove for a block before he said, that was the right answer. I know, Emma said. She seemed a little disappointed, though. He drove. Victoria's call came at 6:47 that evening, after Emma was in bed, not asleep, but in bed with a book, which was a distinction Emma enforced with some specificity, and Nolan was on the couch with the legal pad balanced on his knee and a beer he'd been nursing for 40 minutes. Did you get the documents? She asked. I did, he said. You didn't have to do that. Cole's attorney filed within 4 hours of the incident. They're fast, they're good, and their strategy is going to be to make you look like an aggressor before the charges are formalized. She said this with the directness of someone delivering a weather report. Hargrove is faster and better. It made sense. I could have found my own representation. You could have, she said, but it would have taken you a few days to vet someone decent, and a retainer you'd probably rather use for something else. A pause. Am I wrong? He didn't answer that. I'm not trying to manage you, she said, and the way she said it suggested she'd anticipated the interpretation. I'm trying to make sure one bad Tuesday morning doesn't cost you 6 months of headache because a man with expensive lawyers decided to reframe events. I understand that, he said. I also don't like owing people things I didn't ask to owe. The silence on the line had a quality to it, not uncomfortable, more like she was choosing her words with care, which based on his rate of her was not something she always bothered to do. That's fair, she said finally. I'll be honest with you. I'd like to meet again. Not about the legal situation. Hargrove can handle that on its own and you won't need to do much. I mean separately. I want to talk to you about something. Nolan looked at the ceiling. What kind of something? The kind it makes more sense to discuss in person, she said, if you're willing. He was quiet for a moment. Webb's voice was in the back of his head. People like that don't do things for nothing. And he acknowledged it and then set it aside, because whatever the ledger looked like, the morning had been what it had been, and she'd done what she'd done. And he wasn't the kind of man who paid debts by refusing to have a conversation. I can do Thursday, he said. Emma has art club until 5. Thursday's fine, she said. There's a place called Greystone on Michigan Avenue. Good coffee, quiet enough to talk. 4 o'clock? 4 o'clock, he said. She hung up without a lot of ceremony, which he'd started to recognize as her default. Not rude, just efficient, the way people get when they spend enough time in rooms where everyone wants something from them, and small talk has become a form of overhead. He finished the beer, he looked at the legal pad, he wrote 2 more lines and then put the pad on the coffee table and sat in the quiet of the apartment for a while, listening to the sound of Emma in the other room turning pages. Greystone on Thursday was exactly what she'd said. Quiet enough, good coffee, the kind of place that understood itself. Dark wood and low light and booths with enough space between them that a conversation stayed a conversation. Nolan arrived 7 minutes early because he was always early and was already seated when Victoria came through the door at 3:59 in a coat he didn't recognize, but that looked like it had cost more than his Ford and was worth it. She slid into the booth across from him with the same economy of motion he'd noticed in the cafe, no fuss, no production, and ordered an Americano from the server before the woman had finished her opening sentence. Sorry, she said, not sounding particularly sorry. I've been in meetings since 7. It's fine, he said. She looked at him across the table with the same direct attention he'd been filed under since Tuesday morning. Not intrusive, but complete. The look of someone who didn't do partial attention. How's Emma? She asked. She's good. She told her class about Tuesday. What did she tell them? That her dad was good at his job. Something crossed Victoria's face that might have been a smile if it had traveled the last quarter inch. She's a good kid. She is, Nolan said. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was a professional skill that had personal applications. Victoria wrapped both hands around her Americano and looked at the table for a moment, which he recognized as a person assembling the version of something they wanted to say. I have a problem, she said. Okay. Not an unusual problem in my world, but it's become more acute in the last several months. She looked up. When you run a company the size that mine has become, you carry a certain profile. People know who you are, where you go, what you're doing. Most of the time, that's just background noise. Occasionally, it's something else. Threats, Nolan said. Threats, she confirmed. Mostly indirect. Competitive pressure that crosses lines. People whose interests I've moved against who decide the most efficient response is intimidation rather than litigation. She paused. 6 months ago, one of my directors found a tracking device on her car. 2 months ago, my home address was published on a financial forum by someone with a demonstrable grievance against a deal I completed. Last month, someone accessed the lobby of my building outside of business hours and left something at the reception desk. She stopped. What did they leave? Nolan said. A file folder with photographs. Of me. Over a period of about 3 weeks. Going to the building, leaving the building, at restaurants, at one event I attended. She said this evenly, but there was something underneath it. Not fear exactly, more the tight, controlled quality of someone who has decided to not be afraid of a thing and is executing that decision through effort. No note, just the photographs. Nolan was quiet for a moment. CPD? He said. Reported. They took a statement and the folder. No meaningful follow-up. What I was told, off the record, was that unless there was a specific threat or an incident, there wasn't much to act on. She looked at him steadily. Which is accurate, legally, and completely inadequate, practically. Current security arrangement? I have a driver who doubles as a first response deterrent. Marcus. He's been with me 4 years, he's competent, and his background is municipal law enforcement, which is fine for most things. She paused. What happened Tuesday? Watching how you handled that, Marcus wouldn't have responded that way. Not because he isn't good at what he does, but because what you did came from a different level of training entirely. Nolan looked at his coffee. He knew where this was going now. He'd known, in the background, since the phone call Tuesday night, that low-frequency read that had been threading itself through the last 2 days. "What's the role?" he said. She seemed to calibrate slightly at the directness of it. "Chief of Executive Security. It's a position I've been considering formalizing for about 8 months. I've interviewed 3 people. None of them were right." "What was wrong with them?" "The first one came from a private contractor background. Good technical skills, but the way he assessed situations was—" She paused, looking for it. He kept thinking about optics, how things looked from outside. His reflex was management, not protection. She turned her cup. "The second had the right training, but he was rigid. Everything was protocol, and protocol has value, but the situations that actually threaten people don't follow protocol." She looked at him. "The third one just wanted the salary and the association with a high-profile name. I could see it in the first 10 minutes. "And what makes you think I'm different?" he said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at him with the careful attention she'd been giving him since Tuesday, and she said, "You never put her down." He'd heard her say it before, in the cafe, after it was over, but it landed differently in a quiet booth on a Thursday afternoon than it had in the aftermath of an adrenaline morning. "You were holding her the entire time," she said. 3 men, and you managed what you managed without ever making her secondary. And afterward, when you were talking to the officers, when you were talking to me, you were always half aware of where she was. Not in a nervous way, in a way that was just—" She stopped. "It's the right instinct. Protection isn't a job you do and then clock out of. It's a way of being present." She paused. "That's what I need. Not someone who activates when the situation requires it. Someone who is always reading the environment before the situation requires it." Nolan was quiet. The server refilled his coffee without being asked. He looked at the table for a moment, at the grain in the dark wood. "What happened to your wife?" Victoria asked. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, which he found he preferred to the oblique approach people sometimes used, the careful circling around the thing they actually wanted to know. "Car accident," he said. "November, 3 years ago. Emma was 3. A driver ran a red light on the north side and hit the passenger door." He said it with the flat delivery of something that had been said enough times to have worn smooth on the surface, though the interior of it was different and always would be. "She died at the scene." Victoria didn't say she was sorry. He noticed that. A lot of people said they were sorry, and it was fine. It was the thing you said. But she didn't, and in the space where that would have been, she just sat with it for a moment, which he found more adequate. "That's why you left the Navy," she said. "I had 6 weeks of compassionate leave," he said. "I spent the first 2 in a state I don't fully remember, and the second 4 trying to figure out how to be what Emma needed." He looked up. She was 3. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew something was wrong, and the Navy was going to station me in Virginia Beach, and Emma's support system was here, my late wife's mother, a neighbor she trusted, the routines she knew. I couldn't take her from all of that. He paused. "So I made a decision." "Do you regret it?" "No," he said. And then more honestly, "Sometimes I miss the clarity. The mission is the mission and everything else is noise. Civilian life has a different relationship with clarity. But Emma doesn't need me to have clarity. She needs me to be there." He looked at his cup. "So I'm there." Victoria nodded. She looked like she understood that on a level that went beyond professional context, though she didn't explain it, and he didn't ask. "The position I'm describing," she said, shifting back, "is not without risk. I want to be direct about that. The people I've moved against through various acquisitions and restructurings over the last 5 years include individuals who are not merely competitive. Some of them are people with resources and motivation to do things that are in genuinely gray areas, legally speaking. You'd be the principal. Yes. Which means wherever you are is where the risk concentrates. Typically, she said, though the photograph situation suggests that's not exclusively true. He considered that. What's the schedule structure? I need coverage during business hours, travel, and events. I have a schedule that runs hard Monday through Friday and occasional weekends. I do not need or want someone inside my personal life. I have a home in Lincoln Park. I'm there in the evenings, and that time is mine. Marcus handles the building security through the night. That's an existing arrangement that works. She paused. What I need is someone present for the operational hours, someone who can travel with me, assess environments before I enter them, and respond appropriately if something escalates. And a 6-year-old, Nolan said. She looked at him. Emma, he said, I need to be able to pick her up from school. I need sick days when she's sick, which is more often than you'd think because she makes friends with every kid in her class and shares everything they have, including whatever they're recovering from. I need to be able to go to the school things. Not everything, but the important ones. And I'm not always sure which ones are important until she tells me, which is sometimes the night before. The directness of it landed in the space between them, and Nolan didn't try to soften it. It was the truth, and it was the truth she needed if this conversation was going to be worth anything. Victoria held his gaze without flinching. The salary I'm proposing, she said, includes a provision for backup care if you want it. There's flexibility in the schedule structure during school hours, and the definition of operational hours we build can accommodate the pickup requirement. Events that run late, I travel with advance notice. I can give you scheduling lead time. She paused. I'm not asking you to choose between the job and Emma. I'm asking if you can do both, and I'm trying to structure something that makes it possible. He looked at her for a long moment. What's the number? He said. She told him. He didn't react immediately. He filed it, the way he filed things, processed it against the check engine light, and the broken printer and the school fees and the winter coat Emma was going to need that he'd been budgeting for, and the fact that the Kellerman job was his only active contract and it was going to close in 3 weeks. That's more than I expected, he said. It's what the role is worth, she said. Not a favor. Healthcare, full coverage, her included. He looked at the table. He thought about what Webb had said. People like that don't do things for nothing. And he thought about whether that was a warning he should be heeding or a bias he should be examining. And he thought about the photographs in the folder on the reception desk and the woman across from him who had asked a question he couldn't find a clear answer to about what she wanted and decided, sitting in a quiet booth with a decent Americano, that maybe the answer was just this. She'd seen something she needed and she was being direct about it, and direct was something he respected. He also thought about Emma, which he always came back to, about school fees and winter coats, and the particular way she'd said he's a dad when Mrs. Patterson asked if he was a superhero, the simplicity of it, the complete certainty of it. He thought about what stability looked like for a child whose world had already been reoriented once by a thing that couldn't be fixed or explained away, and what it would mean to give her something that held. He thought about his wife, about the drive home from the hospital in those first raw weeks, Emma asleep in the car seat, the city going by outside, the specific feeling of responsibility without roadmap, the understanding, slow, accumulating, that the one thing he could control was showing up every day in whatever capacity she needed for as long as he was able. He'd been doing that for 3 years. This felt like the next version of it. I have conditions, he said. Tell me, she said. Emma comes first. If she's sick, I'm out. If there's a school event I've committed to, I'm out. Those days I give you as much notice as I can, and I'll help you arrange coverage, but I won't send someone I don't personally vouch for. He looked at her steadily. Second, if I see something in your organization that doesn't sit right with me, I tell you directly, not through channels, not softened, directly. I'd expect that, she said. Third, I need 3 weeks to transition my current clients properly. I won't leave people hanging, she nodded. That's reasonable. And I want to meet Marcus before I start, not to evaluate him. That's not my call to make. But because I need to know who I'm working alongside. Also reasonable, she said. Anything else? He thought for a moment. How's your coffee? He said. She blinked. The shift in register caught her slightly off balance, which he recognized was not something that happened often. Fine, she said. Why? Because you've been looking at it instead of drinking it for the last 20 minutes, he said. And you ordered it before you sat down, which means you wanted it, which means something's on your mind that's keeping you from it. She looked at her cup, then at him. Then she picked up the cup and drank. You're going to be annoying, she said. Not like it was a problem. Probably, he said. She set the cup down. Is that a yes? He thought about all the reasons it might be the wrong decision. The risk, the proximity to a world he'd deliberately stepped away from, the question of what Emma would make of the changed shape of his days, the ledger Webb kept referencing that he still couldn't fully read. He thought about the check engine light. He thought about a 6-year-old drawing Chicago on a placemat and a woman holding the horse carefully by its edges, and the particular feeling of being seen by someone who wasn't looking for anything simple. That's a yes, he said. She didn't celebrate it. She didn't make it a moment. She just nodded, the way she did when a thing had been decided and the next thing was to start doing it. Monday, she said. If 3 weeks is too short for your clients, we can adjust. 3 weeks is fine, he said. She started to reach for her coat and then stopped. She's going to be okay, she said. Emma. He looked at her. I don't have any basis for that, she said. Beyond the obvious. She's clearly smart and she's clearly resilient, and she has a father who would dismantle 3 men without putting her down. A pause. But I wanted to say it. He didn't say anything for a moment. She is, he said finally. She's going to be fine. Victoria put her coat on. She pulled it straight, that functional, no-wasted motion way she did everything, and she looked at him across the table one last time. Monday, she said. Monday, he agreed. She left. He sat in the booth for another 10 minutes, finishing his coffee, which was still good. The restaurant moved around him with its ordinary Thursday afternoon rhythms. A couple near the window, a man on a laptop, the server refilling water glasses with the practiced economy of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. Regular life, regular sounds, the city outside doing what it always did. His phone said 4:47. Emma's art club ended at 5. He left cash on the table and put on his jacket. On the sidewalk, the November air came at him flat and cold, and he stood in it for a moment, looking up at the gray between the buildings, at the light that was already thinning toward evening. Somewhere north of here, Emma was finishing a painting of something that might be a horse or a city or a son reaching for a sandwich, and in 3 weeks something in his life was going to shift its weight in a way that would matter. He'd made decisions under worse conditions with less information. He walked toward the parking garage. He did not look back. The first Monday arrived cold and clear. The kind of Chicago morning that apologizes for nothing. Sky sharp blue, wind off the lake with an edge to it that made your eyes water if you faced it directly. Nolan dropped Emma at school at 7:50, watched her go through the double doors with her backpack and her art club project from Thursday, something she'd described as a horse in space, which her teacher had apparently received with great professional composure. And then he drove to the Sterling Capitol building on South Wacker Drive and sat in the parking garage for 4 minutes, not doing anything particular, just sitting. He did that sometimes before things that mattered. Not from nerves exactly. More from the need to be still before motion, the way you check your equipment one last time, not because you expect to find something wrong, but because the act of checking is itself the preparation. He went in. The Sterling Capitol building occupied the top 6 floors of a 40-story glass tower, and the lobby was the kind of lobby that communicated, without saying anything directly, that the people who worked above it took themselves seriously. Nolan walked through it and felt the particular sensation he always felt in rooms like this. Not intimidation, but awareness of distance, the gap between the world he'd been operating in and the one he was entering. The Ford in the parking garage, the jacket he'd bought specifically for this, which was better than his usual, but still not the same language as what the men in the elevator were wearing. He noted it. He set it aside. It wasn't relevant. Marcus Webb had told him once, years ago during a training evolution that had nothing to do with suits or lobbies, that the most dangerous assumption a man could make was that the environment defined him. You define the environment, Webb had said. The environment is just furniture. Marcus Webb, the original one, not Victoria's driver who shared the name, the coincidence of which Nolan had noted with a private, dry amusement the first time he heard it. Victoria's Marcus Dre, was waiting for him on the 38th floor. He was 51, compact, with the careful eyes of a man who'd spent 20 years as a Chicago police detective before moving into private security, And he met Nolan at the elevator with a handshake that was neither testing nor performative, just direct. "Heard about Tuesday," Dre said. "Good things, I hope," Nolan said. "Heard you were effective," Dre said, "and that you kept the kid in the whole thing." He looked at Nolan with the specific evaluating quality of one professional assessing another. "That's harder than it sounds." "It was a quiet morning until it wasn't," Nolan said. Dre nodded. "They all are." They understood each other in approximately 90 seconds, which was the way it worked when it worked. Not friendship, not yet, but professional recognition. The shorthand of people who've done serious things in serious situations and don't need to perform credentials for each other. Victoria's office was at the corner of the 38th floor, with windows on two sides, and she was on the phone when Nolan came through the door, gesturing at a chair across her desk without breaking the call. He didn't sit. He stood near the window and looked out at the city. The grid of it, the river, the lake in the distant silver gray under the morning, and listened to her end of the conversation, which was about a restructuring timeline at a manufacturing company in Ohio, and noticed the way she talked through a complicated problem. Direct, very little hedging, the specific clarity of someone who had already done the analysis and was communicating conclusions rather than thinking out loud. She hung up and said, "Sorry, Ohio is a situation." "Do you want me to know about Ohio?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "Maybe eventually." She looked at him across the desk. That complete attention, the same as always. "How was the school drop?" "She made it on time. She had a horse in space." "Art club project?" "Apparently." "Is it a good horse?" "She says yes." The teacher's face was neutral. Something that was definitely a smile this time crossed Victoria's face, got further than it usually did, became briefly real. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you the building." The first 3 months were about learning the geometry of a new world. Nolan was good at that. He'd done it in 8 different deployment contexts, and the skill transferred. The ability to read an environment fast, to understand where the load-bearing elements were, where the soft spots lived, who the reliable people were, and who was performing reliability without having it. He learned the Sterling Capitol building the way he'd learned forward operating bases, exits, sightlines, personnel patterns, which security desk guard actually watched the monitors, and which one was on his phone. He learned Victoria's schedule, which was not so much a schedule as a controlled form of organized chaos. She had a COO named Patricia Osei, who managed the calendar with the focused intensity of someone defusing bombs for a living, and even Patricia sometimes looked at what the week had become and made a face. He learned the threat landscape, which was more complex than he'd expected and less dramatic. The photograph situation had not repeated. Whoever had delivered the folder appeared to have been testing rather than escalating, which was its own kind of concerning, because testing meant assessment, and assessment meant someone was still deciding something. CPD's investigation had stalled, which was what CPD's investigation was going to do. Nolan had his own quiet process running alongside it, drawing on contacts he had from the Navy that he didn't advertise, and that produced over 6 weeks a fairly clear picture of who had commissioned the surveillance. He told Victoria on a Wednesday afternoon in her office. "His name is Raymond Castellan," Nolan said. He put a folder on her desk, his own, a clean one, nothing from any official channel. Majority shareholder in a fund called Apex Strategic Partners. You moved against a company they had a position in 14 months ago. Thornton Logistics. Your acquisition and restructuring reduced their stake value by approximately 40%. Victoria looked at the folder but didn't open it immediately. "Castellan," she said. "I know the name." "He's not a direct action risk," Nolan said. "He's a pressure person. He wants you to feel watched, to feel that the environment around you is unreliable. It's a destabilization strategy, not a physical one." He paused. "Which doesn't mean it doesn't escalate. It means the next move is more likely to be a leak to a financial press contact than something physical, but it can get more complicated if the business pressure continues." "It will continue," she said. "I have a position on 2 more companies in Apex's portfolio." "Then we're going to want to document everything going forward very carefully," he said. "And I'd recommend a conversation with your communications team about preemptive media strategy. If he goes to the press, You want your version already in the room. She opened the folder then, read through it in the efficient way she read everything, her eyes moving at a pace that suggested she'd processed text faster than most people and had stopped being self-conscious about it. She closed it. How did you get this? She said. Contacts, he said. Naval contacts. Some, he said, and some from the security consulting work. Small world in that field. She looked at him across the desk. You've been doing this for 6 weeks and you found something CPD hasn't found in 4 months. CPD was working through official channels, he said. Official channels are slow and they telegraph what you're looking at. I wasn't working through official channels. Should I be concerned about how you weren't working through official channels? No, he said, but I'd rather not explain the methodology in detail. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, okay. And he could tell that it was genuinely okay and that she wasn't filing it away as a concern. She was filing it away as a data point about what he was and what he could do, which was a different thing. I want to loop in Hargrove on the Castellan information, she said. Can you give them the folder? Already have a copy ready for them, he said. She looked at him. You came in here expecting me to say that. It was the logical next step, he said. She leaned back in her chair. You're going to keep being annoying, she said, the same way she'd said it in Greystone, like it was a settled fact about weather. Probably, he said. Brandon Cole's legal situation resolved in the 4th month. It resolved badly for Brandon, which was the appropriate outcome in which, Nolan noted, produced in him something more like relief than satisfaction. The misdemeanor assault charges had been upgraded after a review of the full security footage and 3 additional witness statements that Hargrove had identified and compiled. Brandon's attorney had attempted, as predicted, to build a counter-narrative around Nolan's military background. The implication being that a trained special operator had used disproportionate force in a civilian context and that the real victim was the man who'd been outclassed physically. It had not landed well, partly because the footage was unambiguous about the sequence of events, partly because Emma's presence in it, the small figure pressed against Nolan's left side, the moment he crouched to speak to her, the way she counted to 10 with her face against his arm, made the narrative of disproportionate force extremely difficult to sustain in front of any human being who had ever met a child. The charges resulted in a conviction on both counts. Brandon Cole paid fines he could technically afford and received a suspended sentence and a public record that would follow every job application and background check for years. Meridian Investment Group, now fully under Sterling Capital's ownership, had already absorbed his former position into a restructured department. Derek Marsh had resigned before the legal situation concluded. The third companion, whose name had never fully surfaced in any proceeding, had apparently left Chicago entirely. Nolan learned about the conviction from Hargrove, who sent a clean email with the disposition and a note that their representation in the matter was concluded. He read it in the Sterling Capital Building's parking garage before going upstairs, sitting in the better car he'd bought 2 months in when the math finally worked. Nothing dramatic, a used Tahoe with good mileage, but it started every time and the check engine light stayed off. He sat with it for a moment, the ending of the thing. He thought about the look on Brandon's face in the cafe when he'd blocked the exit. The absolute certainty. The practiced ease of a man who'd always found that a certain volume and a certain posture produced a certain result. He thought about how many mornings like that one there had been, in other places with other people who hadn't had the specific combination of circumstance that made Tuesday different. How many times the volume had worked. He didn't feel good about it exactly. He felt something more complicated. The specific weight of a thing being done that needed doing, and the recognition that it was only done because of a fairly narrow series of contingencies. A corner booth. A woman who happened to be watching. A building with a camera in the right place. Justice, he'd learned, was less a system and more a series of narrow windows that most people never found or never recognized in time. He got out of the car and went upstairs. Emma met Victoria on a Saturday in the 5th month. It wasn't planned, which was the only way it could have happened without Emma treating it as an event, which would have made it strange. Victoria had come into the office for a few hours on a Saturday morning. Ohio was still a situation. and Nolan had miscalculated the coverage window and arrived with Emma in tow because the alternative was leaving her at home alone, which was not an alternative. Emma came into the 38th floor wearing her coat and carrying a library book about deep-sea fish that she'd been working through with focused intensity for 3 days. Victoria came out of her office for coffee. At the same time, Emma was standing at Patricia Osei's desk, looking at a photograph on the desk with the frank curiosity of someone who hasn't yet learned that you're supposed to pretend not to look at things. "Is that your family?" Emma asked Patricia. "It is," Patricia said with the patient warmth of a woman who had 4 children of her own and was immune to being caught off guard by small people. "You have a lot," Emma said. "4," Patricia confirmed. "That's too many," Emma said, with the authority of an only child. "3 is too many. 4 is chaos." Victoria had stopped near the coffee station. She was holding her mug and watching this exchange with the expression of someone who finds something quietly delightful and is uncertain whether to show it. Emma turned and saw her. She looked at her for a moment with the flat, uncomplicated attention of a child who hasn't learned to manage her own face yet. "You're the horse lady," she said. "I am," Victoria said. "Do you still have it?" "It's in my office." Emma looked toward the office, then at Victoria. "Can I see?" Victoria looked at Nolan, who gave her absolutely nothing in the way of rescue. "Sure," Victoria said. He followed them both in and stood in the doorway while Emma went directly to the wall behind the desk, where the placemat drawing had been framed. An actual frame, nothing cheap, something that had been measured and matted, and hung between 2 photographs that looked like they'd been there for years. Emma stood in front of it for a moment. "You framed it," she said. "It's good art," Victoria said. Emma looked at her with the specific expression she used when she was deciding if someone was being straight with her. "Mrs. Patterson says everything kids make is good." "Mrs. Patterson is managing a classroom," Victoria said. "I'm not. I framed it because the horse is good, the hat especially." Emma looked at the drawing, at the small flag on the horse's hat, which she'd added with a red crayon at the last minute because she'd decided the horse was important enough to require a flag. "Okay," Emma said. Then she held up the deep-sea fish book. "Do you know what an anglerfish is?" "Tell me," Victoria said. Emma told her, at considerable length. Nolan leaned against the door frame and drank his coffee and listened to his daughter explain the bioluminescent lure of the anglerfish to a billionaire CEO at 9:15 on a Saturday morning, and the billionaire CEO listened with the same complete attention she gave everything, asking questions that were actually questions and not the performative interest that adults sometimes used with children. "That's genuinely horrifying," Victoria said, when Emma finished the section about the anglerfish's mating strategy. "I know," Emma said with great satisfaction. "The ocean is mostly horrifying." "Is that the theme of the book?" "Sort of," Emma said. "But also it's beautiful. Both at once." She said this with a matter-of-factness that suggested she'd already reconciled the tension and found it unremarkable. "Most things are." Nolan looked at his daughter. He thought about how you couldn't take credit for the things that came out of children. They arrived with their own equipment, their own particular way of looking, and the best you could do was not damage it, not sand down the edges of it, not replace their vocabulary with yours. Emma had arrived at the conclusion that most things were beautiful and horrifying at once, through some internal process he'd had no access to, and she'd stated it the way you state facts. And he found himself unexpectedly moved by it in the specific way that children could move you. Sideways, when you weren't guarding against it. Victoria was looking at Emma with an expression that had come fully through whatever surface she usually maintained, and what was underneath it was something uncomplicated and genuine. And Nolan saw it and looked away because it wasn't his to observe too directly. 6 months after the Tuesday morning that started all of it, the Sterling Capital Group hosted its annual charity gala on the top floor of the Wacker building, and the top floor was exactly what the building implied it would be. Glass on all sides, the city 40 stories below doing what it always did, which was sprawl outward in every direction with the particular ambition of a place that had decided very early that it was going to be one of the American cities that mattered. Nolan had been running advance work on the event for 2 weeks. The gala was a public event, a mixed guest list of clients, donors, and civic figures. which meant the threat profile was different from the controlled environments he'd spent the last 6 months managing. He'd worked with the venue's existing security team, supplemented it with 2 contractors he personally knew and trusted, managed the entrance screening protocols, and walked the floor so many times that the catering staff recognized him. An hour before doors, he stood at the edge of the main space and did a final pass of the room with his eyes. The exits, the sight lines, the positions of his people, the layout of the tables against the flow he expected when the room was full. Everything was where it needed to be. He'd done what could be done. Dre appeared at his shoulder. "We're good," Dre said. "We're good," Nolan agreed. "You're going to stand here for the entire event anyway," Dre said. "Probably," Nolan said. Dre made a sound that might have been a laugh. "First 6 months," he said. "You settle into it a little after that." "Does it change?" Nolan asked. "The vigilance?" Dre thought about it. "No, just the way you wear it. Stops feeling like a suit that doesn't fit." He looked out at the city. "You're good at this. I want you to know I think that, because I wasn't sure about you when you started." "I know," Nolan said. "How did you know?" "You checked my positioning every morning for the first month," Nolan said. "Then you stopped." Dre looked at him. "Fair," he said. He moved off to his own station. Victoria arrived 40 minutes before guests, which was earlier than anyone expected and later than Nolan had planned for. She came through the elevator with Patricia 2 steps behind her handling something on a tablet, and she was wearing something dark and precise that suggested she'd made a decision about the evening, and it was the decision of someone who did not consider these events enjoyable, but considered them necessary, and was not going to let the gap between those 2 things show. She saw Nolan and walked directly to him, which she'd started doing, moving toward him in rooms rather than away. The physical expression of a working trust that had been built over 6 months of close proximity and small moments, and the accumulated evidence of someone doing exactly what they said they would. "How does it look?" she said. "Good," he said. "I've got Tanner on the northeast corner and Chen near the bar. Dre's handling the door with the venue team. You'll have a clear line to the service exit at any point in the evening." She looked at him. "I mean that as a professional assessment," he said, "not a prediction." "I know," she said. She looked at the room, at the space that was about to fill with noise and light and the specific social performance of Chicago money, and he could see her doing something internal, the gathering of self that people do before they walk into a room that will require them to be a version of themselves for hours. "You all right?" he said. "I don't love these," she said, which was, he'd come to understand, a significant admission for her, the gap between what she showed and what she said getting briefly smaller. "I know," he said. "I'm fine," she said, more firmly, the version that was for herself rather than for him. "It's one evening. Patricia has your exit time in the schedule," he said. 10:30, non-negotiable. Victoria glanced back at Patricia, who was already on her phone but nodded without looking up. 10:30, Victoria said, "and eat something before the room fills up. You didn't eat today." She looked at him. "Patricia told me," he said. "Patricia tells you too many things," she said. "Patricia told me because she was worried," he said. "She worries about you. She's been doing it for 3 years and she's good at it. Let her." There was a pause. Victoria looked at him with the expression he'd come to associate with her receiving something she hadn't asked for and was deciding whether to resist it. She didn't resist it. "I'll get something from the kitchen," she said. "Good," he said. She moved toward the kitchen corridor and he went back to the room, and something settled in him that was not exactly comfort, but was in the neighborhood of it. The particular feeling of a thing working the way it was supposed to work, not perfectly, not without friction, but functionally, the way a well-used tool works when you've learned its weight. The evening went the way evenings like this went. The room filled. The noise built to the specific register of 100 conversations running simultaneously, underlaid with music that was present but unobtrusive. Victoria moved through it with the composed, practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this for long enough that the performance had become a kind of second language, fluent, not native. Nolan watched the room. There was a moment, around 8:30, when he saw her across the space talking to a man he'd assessed earlier as low risk, a longtime donor, no adversarial connection to any of Sterling Capital's operations. And she caught his eye briefly across the distance and gave him the small nod that had become their shorthand. "I see you. I'm fine. I know where you are." And he gave it back. "I see you. I've got the room. Keep going." It was the whole of it, really. Not dramatic, not the thing you'd describe to someone and have them understand immediately why it mattered. But it was the accumulated weight of 6 months of that exchange, the daily, undramatic practice of being present for someone's safety, of being the person in the room whose job was to make sure she could do her work without looking over her shoulder. And he understood, somewhere in those 6 months, what it was that had been missing from the security consulting work he'd been doing before Tuesday. It wasn't the scale. It wasn't the salary, though the salary had changed what was possible for Emma in ways that still surprised him on random mornings. It was the dailiness of it, the fact that it was specific and continuous, that it was for someone in particular rather than for an abstraction of safety. He'd spent 12 years in the Navy being precise about enormous, distant things, and then 3 years being precise about the immediate and the small, and this was somewhere between those two. A middle distance where the scale was human and the stakes were real and the work was continuous. He thought about this while watching a room full of people he didn't know, and he thought it was strange what a November Tuesday morning could set in motion without intending to. He thought about a table being hit, hot coffee and a placemat with a horse on it, a 6-year-old counting to 10 with her face pressed against her father's arm. He thought about Emma's voice saying, "You didn't put me down," with the specific gravity of a child noting something important. The truth of that was the whole of it, really. Not just the moment in the cafe, but all of it, the larger sense of it. You found the thing that was worth holding and you held it. Not because it was easy or because you knew how it would turn out, but because it was the right thing to hold, and you were the person holding it, and that was enough of a reason. He'd been doing it for Emma since she was 3 years old, and he'd do it for the rest of his life regardless of any other circumstance. What he hadn't expected was that it could expand, that the same instinct that had kept his left hand on his daughter's shoulder in a cafe on a Tuesday morning could find other shapes, other people worth protecting, other versions of itself that mattered. He'd been wrong to think it was singular. He was learning it wasn't. The gala ended at 10:28. Close enough. Nolan rode down in the elevator with Victoria and Patricia and Dre, and the city through the lobby windows was doing its nighttime thing, lit and moving and indifferent to whether anyone was watching, which was one of the things he'd always appreciated about cities. In the lobby, Patricia said goodnight with the efficiency of someone who had another 40 minutes of wrap-up emails waiting, regardless of the hour. Dre stayed with the venue team for lockdown protocol. Victoria and Nolan stood near the lobby door for a moment. "Good evening," he said. "Functional?" she said. "Better than the last 2 years, possibly because I actually ate." "Noted," he said. She looked at him. "How's Emma?" "She finished the fish book," he said. "She's moved on to wolves. Apparently wolves are also both beautiful and horrifying." "She's going to be a scientist," Victoria said. "Or a philosopher," he said. "Right now, she's mostly both and hasn't picked yet." Victoria smiled, fully, this time, the real version, the one that had been appearing more frequently over 6 months in the specific way that trust produces things that caution prevents. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too," he said. She moved toward the building's rear exit where her car was waiting. He watched her go. The specific readiness still in him, always. The awareness of the room even when the room was just a lobby, even when the evening was over. And then he turned and walked toward the parking structure and his Tahoe, and the drive home to the apartment where Emma was at the neighbor Mrs. Callahan's for the evening and would be asleep on Mrs. Callahan's couch with the wolf book on her face. He'd carry her home. She'd wake up halfway and say something only partially coherent about wolfpack hierarchies and then fall back asleep before he got her coat on, and he'd put her in bed with her shoes still on because some battles weren't worth the disturbance, and it was one of the small mercies of parenthood that sleeping children were portable. He thought about all of this on the drive, the familiar geography of it, the specific shape of his life which had been broken once and rebuilt in a different configuration and was now 6 months into yet another reconfiguration, finding something that felt not finished. Nothing was finished. That wasn't how life worked. But functional, real, specific in the way that things are specific when they're actually yours. He parked. He sat for a moment in the Tahoe. He thought about what Webb had said in that phone call. People like that don't do things for nothing. And he thought that Webb wasn't wrong, exactly, but that the ledger wasn't always what you expected. Sometimes what someone wanted from you was the thing they said they wanted. Sometimes the exchange was straightforward. You showed up, you did the work, you were present for the people who needed you to be present, and that was the full accounting. He thought about a horse with a flag on its hat, framed and hung on a wall on the 38th floor. He got out of the car. Mrs. Callahan's apartment was 1 floor below his, and he knocked quietly, and she opened the door in her robe with the exhausted goodwill of a woman who had been a neighbor for 2 years and had become, in the accumulation of small dependencies and reciprocated reliabilities, something closer to family. Emma was on the couch. The wolf book was on her face. He lifted it carefully and set it aside, and Emma moved and made a sound that was not quite a word and then settled. He got her coat on. She woke up in the elevator, halfway, with her eyes not quite open and her hair pressed flat on one side, and said, "Wolves mate for life." "I know," he said. "Is that sad or good?" He thought about it. "Both," he said. "Sometimes both at once." She considered this with the profound, half-unconscious seriousness of a child at the edge of sleep. "Like the anglerfish," she said. "A little," he said. "Okay," she said, and she was asleep again before the elevator reached their floor. He carried her down the hall. He got her into bed with her shoes on because that was the right call, and he stood by it, and he pulled the blanket up and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. That specific, regular sound that was one of the few things in his life that had always been uncomplicated, that he had never learned to take for granted. He turned off the hall light. He sat on the couch in the quiet of the apartment and looked at nothing in particular, at the middle distance of a dark room in a city that was still going outside his windows. He thought about Tuesday mornings, about the ones that looked ordinary right up until the moment they weren't, about the way a table getting hit could rearrange the next 6 months of your life and maybe more, and about whether that was accident or something more like pattern, the way circumstances congregate around the decisions you've already made without knowing you've made them. He'd decided, a long time ago, to be the kind of man who held on when it mattered, to be the kind of man you could count on to still be in position when things got loud. He hadn't decided that in any formal or dramatic way. It had accumulated the way the most important things do, out of small choices made in ordinary moments that only look significant in retrospect. He was that man. He was still figuring out what that meant in this specific life, with this specific shape. But the figuring out was the work, and the work was something he could do. Outside, Chicago did what it always did. The lake was somewhere to the east, cold and enormous and indifferent and permanent, which was one of the things he'd always found steadying about living here. The reminder that something had been here before you and would be here after, and that your particular situation, however large it felt from the inside, was appropriately sized against it. Not small, just proportionate. He turned off the living room lamp. He went to bed. Tomorrow Emma would wake up before 6 and want to tell him something about wolves, and he would listen because he always listened, and the morning would be what it was, and the day would become what it became, and that was enough. That had always been enough. It was the whole thing, really. The whole of what he knew, distilled down to what it actually was. Not some grand framework or earned philosophy or anything that would fit neatly into the kind of sentence you'd put on a wall. Just the practice of showing up. Just the daily, imperfect, unbeautiful act of being present for the people who needed you to be present, for as long as you were able, as fully as you could manage. He'd learned it the hard way, the way most things worth knowing get learned. He wasn't done learning it. He didn't think you ever were.